So my name is Russell Ali, and I'm one of the executive directors here at the University of Cape Town. The department that I oversee is the Development and Alumni Department. That's where we do all the fundraising for the university, and that's also where we look after our relations with our alumni. So I'm sure you've received communication from us in the past. No? Well, you will in the future. You give us your contact details. After the talk, I hope I'll have an opportunity to speak to you a little bit more about what we do, and also maybe encourage you to think about becoming members of the Legacy Society. Not that the talk is going to scare you in any way. So there's no connection between the talk and me asking you to later consider the Legacy Society. No connection at all, purely coincidental. So we are very, very excited to have with us Professor Ntobeko Ntusi to give us the talk this evening on the intersection of cardiovascular disease and aging. Professor Ntusi is actually really one of the leading scholars and bright stars at the University of Cape Town, as I'm sure you'll discover. And of course, as you know, Cape Town, University of Cape Town, the work in the area of cardiology, we've been leaders for decades. Of course, I think this year we're celebrating, was it last year we were celebrating this year we're celebrating the 50th anniversary, of course, of Bernard's first heart transplant. And those of you who follow the news about what's happening at the university and research breakthroughs will also know about the incredible breakthrough recently with some young researchers on showing, on identifying the gene, the link between early onset of heart problems amongst young people. And that's something that the University of Cape Town has actually been at the forefront of. So Professor Ntusi is actually the head then of the Department of Medicine here at UCT and the clinical lead for the cardiovascular magnetic resonance and cardiovascular computed tomography unit at Groote Hospital. He holds the chair of medicine in the Faculty of Health Sciences in the Department of Medicine. And his primary research is on inflammatory heart disease. So he's also very active in the research side and supervises a number of postgraduate students and is involved in leading several clinical studies which are mostly related to his field, in the CMR field, cardiovascular magnetic resonance. So I want to invite him forward, and really on behalf of the Development Alumni Department, really thank him for agreeing to give this lecture, which is an annual lecture that the Development Alumni Department puts on as part of summer school. It's our contribution towards summer school, and we're very pleased that Professor Ntusi has agreed to be our speaker this evening. So, warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Russell, for that very generous introduction. Colleagues, friends, teachers, and I see some students as well in the audience. I greet you on this lovely summer's evening. It's a singular pleasure of mine to be here with you tonight, and a tremendous pleasure to be able to share with you some of my thoughts on the intersection between cardiovascular disease and aging, two subjects, both of which are very close to my heart. And what I will try to do is to situate my discussion within a global health context. My talk will really be a call, if not an impassioned plea, for global solidarity in our quest for improved health. The older I grow, the more I've come to appreciate the value of the work of people working in these areas. And statistically, the chances of me needing their assessment and assistance increase by the passing day. I'm particularly grateful to Deirdre Adams and Russell Ali of the Development and Alumni Department for affording me this platform. Alumni are an integral part of the backbone of the University of Cape Town, and I welcome all alumni in their attendance in this lecture. I should state from the start that while I have no specific disclosures related to this talk, it's worth declaring that I know very little about the subject, in spite of the fact that my first 4 publications were in the area of aging. And in fact, my very first publication while a third-year medical student, the very first of these published in the year 2000, initially in the UCT newsletter, medical newsletter called The Cathartic, and later in the International Federation of Medical Students journal called the Medical Student International, was titled The Particular Afflictions of the Elderly in South Africa, and strangely covers much of what I have to say today. While the population of South Africa has increased significantly since the early 2000s, and in the last 20 years, social grants have increased from 540 rands per month. Many of the observations I made 20 years ago still hold true today. The average lifespan of human beings is increasing, and with it, the percentage of people entering the 65 and older age group, which is growing rapidly and will continue to do so in the next 20 years. From the 1700s to the turn of the 20th century, the average lifespan of humans was static, between 25 and 35 years of age. And in the last century, due mainly to industrialization as well as public health improvements, there's been drastic improvement in the lifespan of humans to over 80 years in places like Europe and Japan. You will note that Africa still lags. Within this age group of 65 years or older, cardiovascular disease will remain the leading cause of death, and the cost associated with treatment of these will continue to increase. Cardiovascular disease incidence continues to increase with advancing age and is present in nearly 3/4 of those 80 years and older. Similarly, the prevalence of cardiovascular disease approaches 90% in those over 80 years of age. Of note, 17% of first ever strokes occur in the very elderly, age 85 and above. While vascular stiffness and rates of hypertension are associated with advancing age, the control of blood pressure remains very poor despite reasonable rates of treatment in this age group. Now, aging is an inevitable part of life and unfortunately poses the largest risk for cardiovascular disease. Although numerous studies have been undertaken in the cardiovascular field to understand both the pathophysiology and genetics of aging, many questions still remain unanswered. In this lecture, I wish to touch on 3 interlinked themes. First, global health. I will talk about its definition and why I think it matters as a theoretical and pragmatic framework upon which to hang my thoughts. Secondly, a consideration of the physiology of aging, and in particular as it relates to the cardiovascular system, as well as a review of cardiovascular disease in aging populations. In this lecture, I will deliberately stay clear of specific cardiovascular entities, and I will deliberately be brief and avoid detail. I will conclude by discussing a global health perspective on cardiovascular disease, particularly in the elderly, and end with a call for global solidarity. So, what is global health? Global health is the health of populations in a global context. It has been defined as the area of study, research, and practice that places priority on improving health and achieving equity in health outcomes for all people worldwide. Problems that transcend national borders or have global political and economic impact are often emphasized. Thus, global health is very much about worldwide health improvement, reduction of disparities, and protection against global threats that disregard national borders. And importantly, global health is not to be confused with international health, which is a branch of public health that focuses on developing nations and foreign aid efforts by industrialized countries. Global health can be measured as a function of various global entities and their prevalence in the world and the threat they pose to decrease life in the present day. So global health employs several perspectives that focus on determinants of health, as well as distribution of health in international contexts. And these include broadly medicine, which has to do with the pathology of diseases and promotion, prevention, diagnosis and treatment, public health, which emphasizes public health promotion, epidemiology, which helps identify risk factors and causes of health problems, demography, which provides data on policy decisions, economics, which emphasizes cost effectiveness and cost benefit, and other social sciences such as sociology, law, psychology, developmental studies, anthropology, and many others. Both individual organizations and larger societies working in the domain of global health often face many questions regarding ethical dilemmas and human rights. The predominant agency associated with global health is the World Health Organization. Other important agencies that impact on global health include the agencies of the United Nations. And the United Nations system has also played an integral role in cross-sectoral actions to address global health and its underlying socioeconomic determinants. With the declaration of the Millennium Development Goals in the year 2000 and the Sustainable Development Goals in the year 2015. I note that health conditions associated with the three of the 8 Millennium Development Goals. However, in the Sustainable Development Goals, health and well-being is only one of 17 important determinants in the context of social justice and global health. The Millennium Development Goals were problematic for several reasons. First, $750 million was needed to effect the strategies, and the rich countries were unable to produce this in the 15 years of the Millennium Development Goals, despite being able to produce 17 trillion to save a failing bank system within 2 years after the economic crisis of 2008, with most of that money, of course, going to bankers. Second, many countries, in fact, showed regress rather than progress in relation to these Millennium Development Goals. Despite the definition of poverty having been changed and the analysis of progress by major agencies also shifted backwards to 1990 as a way of increasing the likelihood of apparent progress. And the third problem with these Millennium Development Goals was that the strategies very much favored the richer countries in the global north, and in fact widened the existing disparities between them and the poorer countries in the global south. For example, if one examines the report on the countries considered to be most corrupt during this phase of the Millennium Development Goals, you will see that dark red implies highly corrupt, and with the exception of Russia, the vast majority of these highly corrupt countries are in the global south, with North America and Europe being considered very clean, in other words, not corrupt at all. And yet, if one examines which countries enabled and benefited most from this corruption, it is quite clear if we look at the sale of armaments that the United States and Russia, and to a lesser extent Europe, were the greatest beneficiaries of keeping corrupt governments in place. Hence, doomed to fail from the offset, these Millennium Development Goals fail to advance global health. In particular, global threats like climate change, which had 5 times greater impact on sustaining poverty in the global south, were not addressed at all by these Millennium Development Goals. In adopting the Sustainable Development Goals in the year 2015, the United Nations member states launched the world on a quest without precedent in human history. These Sustainable Development Goals elevate global health and development aspirations and envision a world that is far more prosperous, far more secure, far more healthy, and far more equitable than has ever been, where human rights and dignity are universally respected, and where human development unfolds in a manner that preserves and protects the natural environment and human dignity. If one examines progress in the first 2 years of these Sustainable Development Goals, from the year 2015 to the year 2017, there has indeed been significant progress. But you will note again that all the major agencies do not start measuring from 2015, but rather from the year 2000, like they did with the Millennium Development Goals. In the quest to end poverty in all forms, the number of people living in extreme poverty has been reduced from 1.7 billion to 767 million globally. However, the proportion of vulnerable populations who have access to social protection systems remains very low, particularly in the global south. In the quest to end hunger, to achieve food security and improve nutrition, and to promote sustainable agriculture, we have fared very poorly. 63% of those who suffer hunger daily reside in Africa. And you will note that we still have a high incidence of childhood stunting and very high incidence of childhood and adult obesity, paradoxically. And in the quest to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being of all ages, there has been notable progress, including reduction in global maternal mortality ratios, reduction in tuberculosis incidence, and a small but notable reduction in the risk of dying from non-communicable disease. While there is hope for success, the 3 short years that have passed since the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed have dimmed prospects of achieving many of these visionary aims. In contrast to the international solidarity, shared commitment, and increased investment that in many ways characterize the era of the Millennium Development Goals, much of the world has since 2015 turned inward towards authoritarianism, repression, worsening human rights violations, a diminished role for civil society, a policy of austerity for public investment, and suspicion of international cooperation. Because of civil conflicts that have yet to elicit an appropriate response, more people than ever before are displaced from their homes and countries. At a time when the fruits of scientific advances are so evident, denial in many clusters of the role of humankind in the degradation of our environment threatens the very health and well-being of our planet and our civilizations. Under the Agenda for Sustainable Development, universal health coverage serves as the primary vehicle for continuing and fully leveraging the momentum on health. Sustainable Development Goal number 3 calls for action by the year 2030 to ensure every person's access to essential health services, including medicines and vaccines, and protection from financial risks associated with health care. Expanded health coverage has been shown to improve both access to health as well as reducing financial risks, as well as improving population health, although additional research is needed to inform efforts to maximize health-promoting benefits of increased health coverage. In addition to linking Sustainable Development Goal number 3 and efforts to end extreme poverty, universal health coverage also offers a potential platform for integrating diverse health services and approaches. Universal health coverage aims to promote equity in health access and outcomes, remove deterrents associated with requirements that health service users pay at the point of care, strengthen national health data and monitoring systems for evidence-based decision-making, and promote efficient use of health infrastructure. Numerous low and middle-income countries have made important strides in expanding health coverage, including 24 countries that together account for nearly a third of the world's population. However, the gap between aspirations and reality for health coverage remains gaping. South Africa is only a handful of nations still trying to establish universal health coverage. You will note that many countries, including the US, still do not have universal health coverage, as depicted in gray in this slide. 400 million people lack access to essential health services, and household medical expenses impoverish many or push deeper into poverty at least 10% of people in low and middle income countries. And in many countries working towards universal health coverage, many health services remain inaccessible to beneficiaries, with especially weak coverage reported for services for non-communicable diseases, including cardiovascular disease, and the elderly are particularly marginalized. In a country like South Africa, the private sector will need to make great concessions in order to sustain its existence and to ensure the success of universal health coverage. And so I move to the intersection of cardiovascular disease and aging. Of common chronic conditions, heart disease is only second to arthritis as a cause of morbidity, and imperatively is the leading cause of cardiovascular mortality in older persons throughout the world. Normal aging is associated with a decreased compliance of the central arteries due to a number of age-related changes in the structural components of the artery. Older persons have increased amounts of collagen in the arterial walls, and the function of the endothelium in aged vessels is abnormal. This decreased vascular elasticity and compliance is commonly encountered in clinical practice as isolated systolic hypertension, a condition characterized by elevated systolic blood pressure, but normal diastolic blood pressure, and therefore a widened pulse pressure. The hearts of aged individuals have increased mass, even in the absence of afterload conditions like hypertension, aortic stenosis, or hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy. There are decreased number of myocytes. These are the cells that make up the muscle of the heart, but the remaining myocytes actually are enlarged. The heart, importantly, has two fundamental functions. The first is to contract and pump blood, which perfuses all organs to keep us alive. And the second, equally important, is to relax and fill with blood in diastole when the heart is still. Impaired relaxation, or diastolic dysfunction as we call it, is a characteristic feature of the aging heart due to increased scarring and fibrotic burden in the heart muscle. Aortic valve sclerosis is commonly encountered in older persons and is considered a normal consequence of aging, being present in nearly 50% of those 75 years and older. The presence of aortic valve sclerosis is not considered to be pathological in the absence of aortic valve stenosis. And an important concept in the aging of the cardiovascular system is ventricular vascular coupling, which theorizes that the increase in vascular and ventricular stiffness combine to achieve stability in resting cardiac output, albeit with reduced cardiac reserve. The conduction system of the cardiovascular system undergoes progressive fibrosis or scarring, and in a 75-year-old, an estimated 10% of the original pacemaker cells in the sinus node of the heart are still functional. Normal degeneration and reduction in both sympathetic and parasympathetic tone results in lower resting heart rate and lower maximal heart rates that can be achieved during exercise in the aging heart. Importantly, the renal system impacts most directly on the cardiovascular system in the context of advanced age. As the kidneys age, their ability to excrete ingested sodium decreases, leading to sodium retention. Changes in the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system also result in salt and water retention. Thus, older patients are more sensitive to volume changes than their younger counterparts. Chronic kidney disease is associated with accelerated calcification of the cardiovascular system, increasing cardiovascular stiffness and cardiovascular death. Decrease in the normal baroreceptor responsiveness results in more significant blood pressure fluctuations with posture in older persons. Normal aging also affects cognition. Even those without common problems such as dementia or mild cognitive impairment. A normal age-related cognitive decline may result in difficulty in memory, which may start setting in as early as the 30s. The cause of this syndrome is unknown, and postulates include shortening of telomeres, increased oxidative stress, reduction in immune function, and genetic predisposition. And patients with comorbid cardiac disease have got accelerated cognitive decline. Gait disturbances and immobility in the elderly are very common, and up to 82% among those aged 85 and older. As many as 50% of over 80 years of age have at least one fall per year. Immobility and a sedentary lifestyle exacerbate the physiologic effects of other systemic conditions and result in decreased quality of life and exacerbate deconditioning, making falls much more likely. The risk of falls is increased with the use of cardiovascular and psychotropic medications, as well as neurological conditions in the elderly. Exercise training in the elderly is effective in improving functionality and quality of life, as well as reducing falls and reducing cardiovascular disease. And lastly, altered pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics are characteristic in older patients. Decreased volume of distribution of drugs and decreased creatinine clearance have led to significant changes in drug effect profiles and drug concentrations. Elderly patients are frequently on multiple prescriptions, over-the-counter medications and supplements, all of which may contribute to polypharmacy and adverse drug-to-drug interactions. The overall accumulation of comorbid conditions and decrease of functionality and physiologic reserve is referred to as frailty. Frailty involves the global reduction in ability to cope with physiological stress and increases susceptibility to disease, susceptibility to complications, and susceptibility to death. Diabetes is associated with worsening chronic kidney disease, frequent admissions to emergency rooms for hyperglycemia, higher risk of stroke, ischemic heart disease, and congestive heart failure in elderly patients compared to non-diabetics. These observations are underpinned by physical and functional adaptations in the elderly combined with other traditional cardiovascular risk factors like hypertension and abnormal lipids to accelerate cardiovascular disease. In fact, the risk of cardiovascular disease increases significantly with advancing age based on the number of cardiovascular risk factors present, as demonstrated in this recent publication. At the age of 55, although men and women have similar lifetime risk of cardiovascular disease, there are considerable differences in time of first manifestation. Men are more likely to develop coronary artery disease as a first manifestation of cardiovascular disease, while women are more likely to have cerebrovascular events and heart failure as their first events. However, these differences disappear by the time both sexes reach the 90s. This is a powerful slide showing that despite the low frequency of cardiovascular disease in sub-Saharan Africa in 1990, mortality was very high amongst both African men and women, in fact similar to those in developed countries. And in the period between 1990 and 2013, cardiovascular disease has increased substantially in sub-Saharan Africa, with mortality rates even higher when compared to those of high-income countries. So, to conclude, and to share with you my thoughts on a global health perspective on cardiovascular disease in the elderly, how can we think differently about cardiovascular disease in Africa, and in particular cardiovascular disease in the elderly? I believe that increased global solidarity will be key, and that global health will provide important lessons for us. First, we need to think about adopting a life course perspective to health, rather than focusing on maintaining health, and in particular cardiovascular health, when frailty has set in. Second, South Africa and other countries need to consider the acceleration of universal health coverage, taking into consideration issues of equity, access to health care, appropriateness, and affordability of care. To this end, South Africa has released a framework for universal health coverage, which still lacks detail. In our setting, the model must recognize that the poorest and most vulnerable, including the elderly, who can contribute least to the national health insurance, often have the greatest health needs. Fundamentally, the setup of such a universal health coverage must consider the direct costs, the needs of the population, as well as both services that are present and those that are needed. Governments must seriously and urgently consider the effects of climate change on wellness and health. Over the last 50 years, human activities, particularly the burning of fossil fuels, have released sufficient quantities of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases to trap additional heat in the low atmosphere and affect the global greenhouse gases, resulting in an increase in temperatures. In the last 130 years, the world has warmed by approximately 1 degree Celsius. And you might think this is not very significant. Each of the last 3 decades has been successively warmer than the preceding one, since 1850. As a consequence, sea levels are rising, glaciers are melting, and precipitation patterns are changing. Extreme weather events are becoming more intense and frequent. Although global warming may bring some localized benefits, such as fewer winter deaths in temperate climates and increased food production in certain areas, the overall health effects of a changing climate are likely and evidently negative. Climate change affects social and environmental determinants of health, clean air, safe drinking water, sufficient food, and secure shelter. Cardiovascular and respiratory disease from inhaled biofuels from the surrounding air is on the increase. Extreme high air temperatures contribute directly to deaths from cardiovascular and respiratory disease. particularly amongst the elderly. In the heat wave of the summer of 2003 in Europe, for example, more than 70,000 excess deaths were recorded in those over 65 years of age. Pollen and other aeroallergen levels are also higher in extreme heat. These can trigger asthma, which affects around 300 million people. Ongoing temperature increases are expected to increase this burden. Imperatively, climate change affects the epidemiology of waterborne infections, and malaria infections are also affected by climate. Areas with weak health infrastructure, like sub-Saharan Africa and other developing countries, will be the least able to cope without assistance to prepare and respond to climate change. I wish to emphasize the importance of sound governance and human solidarity in the quest for improved health. While many believe that might is right, in other words, that those who have and wield power should have the loudest voice and greater access to resources and control, that by having power, they can effect the greatest change in society. However, I would like to echo the favorite words of Nelson Mandela, which he borrowed from Abraham Lincoln, that right is might, that right makes might. In October of the year 1859, when Abraham Lincoln was preparing to launch his presidential campaign, he accepted an invitation to lecture at Henry Ward Beecher's Church in Brooklyn, in New York, and chose a political topic which required months of painstaking research. His law partner at the time, William Herndon, observed, "No former effort in the line of speech making had cost Lincoln so much time and thought as this one." In that speech, Abraham Lincoln shared his views on the abolition of slavery in the US, a view which was not supported by many, and in fact had not been supported by the majority of the founding fathers of the US. He remarked that, "Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us, to the end, dare to do our duty as we understand it." And in this important message, he emphasized that when we are led by sound conscience, doing what is right, therein lies the power to bring out sustainable and meaningful change, and ultimately the power to do good. It is my firm conviction that our efforts to reduce health and suffering amongst all, including the elderly and other vulnerable groups in our society, our efforts must at all times be underpinned by social justice. The Millennium Development Goals hold the promise to improve global health through global solidarity in a world devoid of unequal distributions of power, devoid of unfair economic arrangements, and devoid of bad politics. It is my hope that this global solidarity will allow us to see increased shared commitment, increased investment in health, less authoritarianism, and less repression, with improving human rights and increased international cooperation in our quest to improve global health. I end by asking you all of you to play your role in promoting this global solidarity. Thank you for your attention. So I welcome comments and questions from the audience. I don't know, oh, here's a mic. I wonder if somebody minds passing it around. There's some questions in the middle. I might just passing it to the back. Thank you.
I think I heard you mention the interaction of various medications which we may be taking. Would you like to perhaps expand on that a bit? Some of us are taking half a dozen pills a day over a period of some 20 years, and we're still here. Thank you.
So in older persons, the ability to metabolize drugs changes significantly, as well as the ability to be able to clear drugs from the kidneys is also reduced. And many people, because of intercurrent health conditions, end up taking a number of drugs, and the toxicity that might result from taking these drugs may be worsened when many of them are taken at the same time. Often, many drugs interact with each other to impair each other's metabolism, and some drugs may be inappropriately increased within the system, and some have their effects reduced. And so it's important for doctors looking after older patients to make sure that the intended consequences of the drugs are maximized and the unintended side effects of these drugs are minimized.
Thank you.
There's another question over here and then one over there. Oh.
I can talk loudly.
Fantastic, please do.
Just to say, I've had kidney stones. Now, if you have a problem with kidneys, does that mean an increased risk of cardiovascular disease as well?
Not necessarily. So kidney stones on their own don't always lead to chronic kidney problems in the vast majority of people. When kidney stones have been present for a long time or have been recurrent, they can then damage kidneys. And in patients with kidney disease, cardiovascular complications are the biggest cause of death. But the presence of kidney stones on its own doesn't mean that you will get either cardiovascular disease or chronic kidney disease. Yes?
Yes, could you just comment on the role of diet, the diet, sort of kind of thinking on the diet hypothesis?
So asking me to wade into muddy waters. The study of the diet and its relation to cardiovascular disease is actually one of the most well-studied areas in cardiovascular medicine, in one of the areas where we have the greatest evidence. And so what we call a DASH diet, which is associated with high intake of fruits and vegetables, less red meat, less fats, and less protein, is good for you. And such a diet should contain as little salt as possible and increase the intake of potassium. And it is associated with very favorable cardiovascular outcomes. So in other words, I may summarize it to you that if it tastes good, spit it out. The ongoing debates in the popular media about presumed effects of high-fat diets remain to be proven with no evidence to support them. Yes.
Cardiac ablation. I don't think I need the mic. Do you believe in cardiac ablations?
Yes, I'm a firm believer in cardiac ablations where the indications are appropriate. So for those in the know, for people with disturbances in the functioning of the conduction system of the heart, resulting in funny electrical patterns that result in funny heart rhythms, some of the treatments may be medical, but if these don't work, and the benefits will clearly outweigh the risks, then it's appropriate to consider ablation of the abnormal circuits, electrical circuits within the heart. And these are done using either radiofrequency to ablate them or just cryotherapy, where you place a very cold object within the heart. And when the indications for such tests are appropriate, the results are actually very good.
Thank you. And what causes high blood pressure? Is that nutrition? Is tension related to high blood pressure? And does the pressure of the body affect the pressure of the heart?
So that's a complex question. What causes high blood pressure? The simple answer is that we don't know. We like to think of blood pressure as coming in two forms, what we call essential hypertension, which normally runs in families, typically tends to occur in a lot of people in their 40s and 50s, and by the time people reach the age of 75, about 60% of people will have essential hypertension, and this accounts for 85% of people with hypertension, and the causes are really multifactorial, from other cardiovascular risk factors, the aging-related stiffness of blood vessels, genetic causes that may predispose people. And then the other 15% of members of the population who have hypertension have what we call secondary hypertension, where the blood pressure occurs as a result of another underlying disease entity. And these are easier to treat and reverse when you identify them early on. So your other question related to the relationship between hypertension and glaucoma, or increased pressure in the eyes. And even though the two are both common conditions and often coexist, their mechanisms of causation are completely independent.
May I ask you something?
Yes.
Cholesterol. They always suggest that you take a statin, simvastatin, aspirin, whatever it is. But some people say that statins are very bad for one. But once you're on it, you're not allowed to get off it. Even if you diet and you get your cholesterol perfect, the doctors always say don't stop taking the statins. That's question one. Question two, you were saying that a lot of people may take 10 tablets or whatever it is for the heart, and they swallow them all at the same time, and this has a bad effect. Is that what I heard you say?
No.
I thought I heard you say that.
So
if, for instance, you take ecotrin and simvastatin, and both should be taken with meal, Can one take them simultaneously, or is it better to split up your tablets over
Perhaps I can answer the second question first, and I think this is a question that you probably should explore in greater detail with your primary care provider. But in principle, most medications when taken at the same time are fine, but in older people, because of the changes that occur in terms of their ability to metabolize these drugs, the risk of interactions and side effects is increased. But it doesn't mean that you should stop taking your medication. To answer your first question about statins and them being bad for you, again, statins are very well studied and an area where the evidence for their use in medicine is very robust and unquestionable, and probably in excess of 20 clinical trials have been done to prove the efficacy of statins for reduction of lipids and cholesterol, but importantly for reduction of cardiovascular disease. In a small proportion of people, about 5%, statins may be associated with muscle stiffness or muscle aches.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, but the vast majority of people take them without any side effects. Our approach to a patient with an elevated cholesterol would be, depending on the level of that elevated cholesterol, initially to attempt lifestyle changes and a good diet. And if that doesn't work within 3 months, then you would start them on a statin. And the reason most doctors will tell you to continue your statin even when your cholesterol is normalized is because once you stop it, it's likely to rebound and increase. But importantly, because the statin have what we call pleiotropic effects, in other words, they have a number of other very good consequences from their use other than lipid reduction, and so are very good for you to take anyway.
Lovely answer.
So I'm happy to take 2 more questions, one there and another one there. We'll make it 3.
Thank you. Could you comment on the gender differences in cardiovascular disease between men and women? In particular, the sort of fairly recent realization that men suffer largely from coronary artery disease of the large coronaries and women of the microvascular system. And what is being done about particularly developing diagnostic tools for the latter?
Excellent question. For a long time, people have said that women don't get coronary artery disease and that women are less likely to die from heart attacks. And in the last 15 years, our ability to diagnose coronary artery disease, and in particular different forms of heart attacks, has improved significantly. And what we've realized is that, firstly, the symptoms for occluded coronary vessels are completely different in women compared to men. And so because of the different presentation, their cardiovascular disease is often under-recognized or missed completely. And secondly, that with the advent of being able to image inside the coronary blood vessels and to measure both pressure and resistance within those vessels, we've also recognized that the patterns of coronary artery disease between men and women are different. So men tend to, as you correctly say, present with disease of the large blood vessels, what we call the epicardial coronary artery vessels, and women tend to present with disease of the very tiny blood vessels or capillaries within the heart. Now, the first kind, the larger blood vessels, are easy to treat, either in the form of medication, and if that doesn't work, you can put in a stent or a balloon, or when you've got multiple disease, you can ask somebody like Professor Brink to do a bypass operation to bypass the diseased areas. The latter form of disease is much harder to treat, and there have been a number of clinical trials looking at traditional cardioprotective medications, and to date, none of them have been shown to be of any benefit. But our ability to diagnose this entity is now very robust and certainly can be picked up earlier. And the hope is that in the near future, we'll have newer drugs entering our armamentarium to allow women relief from this form of heart disease.
There's a big trend in North America at the moment for what we call primary prevention. And this involves treating normal people with beta blockers and calcium channel blockers, and now I see even the Mayo Clinic has come out to say that we should be treating patients with metformin who are actually not diabetic. This is a whole move towards the so-called primary prevention. What are your views on this? Because everybody wants the kind of the pill now, which is going to include all of these things. Is this pie in the sky business, or is this actually worthwhile?
So perhaps I can start by making a correction that the concept of primary prevention is not new, it's an old one. So we differentiate between primary forms and secondary forms of prevention. If you have a risk factor for a disease, but have not yet had an event that renders you as suffering from that disease, there are things that we can do to prevent you from developing that disease, and we call that primary prevention. And once you've had an event, like a heart attack, in order to prevent you from dying from your heart disease, there are certain things that we can do, and these we call secondary prevention. So to answer your question, the concept of primary prevention really refers to people who have not had cardiac events, but these are not normal people. These are people with derangements in the pathways that result in development of heart disease. And so the logic, and in fact backed by very robust evidence, is that if you can intervene early and appropriately, you can then reduce the likelihood of developing cardiovascular disease, or at least retard the rate of progression of those risks for cardiovascular disease. And there have been a number of trials looking at different agents for primary prevention of cardiovascular disease, and most of them support such an approach, but not in normal people, but in people with risk factors for heart disease. And then the second point you talk about is the concept of a poly pill, which combines many different forms of cardiovascular medication in a single drug, which would increase the likelihood of adherence and make it easier for people to take a single pill rather than multiple pills, but of course has a whole host of problems associated with it. Salim Youssef, based at McMaster in Hamilton in Canada, has probably done the most work in this area with studies in North America, in Europe, as well as India, and has shown that in people at risk of developing heart disease, the use of such a poly pill actually does reduce the incidence of heart disease. It's just called a poly pill, which means that you've got many pills combined in one pill. And the final question at the back.
Okay, thanks very much, Dr. Ntusi. My name is Mandisa. You mentioned the impact of the climate change on the lives of elderly people. And I would like to refer to what is currently happening here in the Western Cape with regards to drought and things. And though it's not affecting elderly only, and number two, how do you foresee intervention in regards to the issue of environment? Because you find that where people like informal settlement, there's plenty of water because there's no restriction in those areas, but the environment is not conducive. You find there's dirt there. You find there doesn't seem to be awareness in terms of keeping the area clean, and then you link up with the elderly people that are staying there. And I don't know if maybe your intervention would include areas where the circumstances that are hard hit by issue of poverty, so that people could be not necessarily educated, could be conscientized in terms of the environment and clean water and whatever, because those diseases are the ones that cause the resources to be utilized whilst there's least contribution. I don't know if you could comment on that.
Thank you. I knew I should have made his question the last. It's a very important but complex question, and I'm not sure if there is a simple answer. So your question is wide-ranging, and you covered many areas, but the first relates to the threat of water shortages and the impact that it might have on health. Being a clinician in a hospital, I worry significantly about the impact that water shortages will have on our ability to be able to provide care to indigent patients. But also being an academic where water is a crucial aspect of the work that we do in laboratories as well as other places of learning within the university. This shortage of water will impact in profound ways on the nature of our work, and one worries that the quality of water being provided from alternate forms may also affect the quality of the work that we'll be able to provide. In terms of poverty alleviation, I think that one obviously needs a intersectoral approach that combines input from a variety of perspectives, and I don't think there is one simple answer to your question, but I think efforts to accelerate these in our society are needed urgently, and at the moment not enough is done.
Thank you very much. I'm sure you will agree, a very wide-ranging talk that I think what was so significant was to put all these medical issues also within a context, within a socio-economic and a global context. And we really want to thank you for that, for opening our minds and deepening our understandings. And I know that many of us would have wanted to use this as a personal consultation. That was not the purpose, but we thank you for your generosity in also offering some personal consultations. This is a very important year for the University of Cape Town. It's, some of you will know, it's the centenary, the 100th anniversary in 189 years that the University of Cape Town has actually been in existence. that the University of Cape Town has existed as a dedicated degree issuing university. So when the university was first formed in 1829 as the South African College, it also incorporated a school and did many other things besides just being a university. And then on the 2nd of April, 1918, is when the University of Cape Town as a degree issuing university actually came into being. And so we are celebrating our centenary. So it's a very significant milestone. That's why you see behind me that poster board distinguishing UCT. We're involved in quite a big campaign as part of the centenary, and also as we approach our 200th year of our existence. And that's to grow the university's endowment, which provides the university with a source of money that actually enables it to have a greater degree of flexibility in being able to do strategic things, to make decisions about where it needs to put its resources, where the challenges are. And as you know, in the last 2 years, the higher education sector has really been battered. And although many of us may have issues with the way in which these battles have been waged and with some of the actions, I don't think that any of us can question the need for higher education to be properly resourced. We see the results. We see it in the breakthrough research. We see it in the way in which it improves our country, but most importantly, also in the opportunities that it provides for our young people. Any successful country that you look at anywhere in the world has successful universities. And so there's no downside in funding universities appropriately, and no downside in providing opportunities for our young people, particularly those who are in financial situations through no fault of their own where they can't pay for their studies. Either the state must do it, and so the fact that education this year, moving forward, that free education will be extended. We don't yet have universal free education, but those of you who are familiar with how higher education is funded will know that the state provided a bursary loan called the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, NSFAS. And up until the end of last year, the threshold for NSFAS was 125,000 Rand combined annual family income. So you could see how low the threshold was. So that if your family income, combined family income, was below 125,000 Rand per annum, you could qualify for state funding for the state bursary. The students obviously were protesting and demanding that this education needs to be provided freely for all students because that's such a low threshold. So the announcement that was actually made is not that there will be universal free education, but that the threshold is now going to be increased to 350,000 Rand per annum, which is significant because it opens up opportunities for many more young people from financially disadvantaged backgrounds to actually access university. And the other important development was that instead of this being a loan, in other words, students would have to pay it back, which means that when they finish, they sit with this debt and they delays the contributions that they can make to their siblings and others. Now this is actually a bursary, so there's no obligation to pay it back, provided that they actually are successful and pass. So it's quite an important advance, but it still places higher education in a very precarious situation because most of the money is going towards funding bursaries, and very little money is going towards research. And that is really where you come in. And that's what this campaign is about. It's saying help us to try and get more and more young people to university, but also help us to fund research, because it's research that makes a difference. And the University of Cape Town has been in the very fortunate position that it has been able to produce cutting-edge research. I mean, what makes the University of Cape Town different from many other universities around the country, in fact around the continent, is the quality of our research. And that does not come from the government subsidy. That actually comes from research grants, and that comes from us going out and raising money. And so we want to appeal to you to really think seriously about becoming part of the Distinguishing UCT campaign in this 100th year of university providing degrees. We can start with 100 Rand and we can go up in multiples of 0. But it's really to think seriously about it and to also think about our Legacy Society, because this event has been funded by the Legacy Society, sponsored by the Legacy Society, which is a way of plan giving. It's a way of saying, you know, I want to make a difference long after I'm not here, because this contribution really makes a difference between a society that is developed and can improve the quality of lives and provide opportunity for people. Lou and Fahim, I think, are around, and they are, I think I saw Fahim there, and I saw Lou is the back of the camera. They are the two people who actually responsible for the Legacy Society, and together with Lebo and others are responsible for putting on this event. So I want to thank them, and if you're interested in hearing more and learning more about the Legacy Society and how you can become a member of the Legacy Society, I encourage you to speak to them. They do a lot of wonderful things and put on a lot of wonderful events. We always say that if you join the Legacy Society, the great thing about it is we have to acknowledge you while you're still around. So all the events that we do, operas and the theatre and lecture series like this, and dinners and other networking events. So we really encourage you to think about it, and you can speak to them. Ntobeko, I want to really thank you. And just a small gesture, some red wine, which I'm told is actually very good for the heart, right? So thank you very much. Wonderful.